Hey everybody, it's Jim from Cigars. And spring is here and summer is coming. And with that, in most parts of the world, we're going to have warmer air temperatures and higher humidity. So it's a good time to do a little review on managing our humidor during the spring and summer warmer months. An important point to remember in this whole thing is that warmer air holds more moisture than cooler air. So you can have 70% relative humidity when it's 70 degrees, but if you have 70% humidity when it's 78 degrees, you're going to have a lot more moisture in the air. So let's look at how that works. Basically, air temperature, think about it in this diagram I'm showing you like a sponge. And the size of the sponge depends on the temperature of the air. This one I'm showing is a very extreme example, 80 degrees Fahrenheit versus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. But the difference in how much moisture that holds at 50% humidity is like 250%. But let's look at a more realistic range. And I'm going to use what's called a psychrometric chart. And this is a chart that's used by engineers in the HVAC and the heating and air conditioning business for applications where humidity is important because it relates temperature and humidity. All right, let's look at this chart. And what I did is I took 65 degrees Fahrenheit, which is kind of a typical winter temperature in many parts of the Northern Hemisphere. And then I took 75 degrees, which again, warm summer day, and you may not turn the air conditioning on even at that temperature. So the temperature during the summer is going to drift up and down a little bit and get higher than it normally does in the winter. So let's look at that on the chart. Looking at 65 versus 75 degrees. The darker line is 65 degrees. So I'm going from 65 at the bottom across. You can see it's 65 where the circle is, goes up to the 70% humidity curve. And then we go across to the right. We draw that dark line across to the right, and we come up with 0.009 pounds of moisture per pound of dry air. And that's what we really care about in our humidor, not necessarily the relative humidity, but how much moisture is in that air, and that depends on temperature. Okay, now let's look at 75. And you see that we start at 75 at the bottom of the circle, and we go up to 70% humidity on this curve. Then we go across, and we see we have 0.013 pounds of moisture in a pound of dry air. So that's quite a big difference. That's about over 40%. So all things being equal, if we're humidifying to 70% relative humidity at both those temperatures, we're going to have a lot more moisture in the air. And here's something scary. Let's go back to look at that chart. That red line that's dotted is looking at the assumption that we have the same amount of moisture, that 0.013 pounds per pound of dry air. We are doing that at 65 degrees. And that gives you an idea about how significant this difference is. If we look at that big red splotch there is where we'd end up. We'd end up almost at 100% humidity in that curve where that splotch is, that kind of arc-shaped thing, is what's called a saturation curve or the condensation curve. And that means you got condensation at that. So the point of this is you got a lot more moisture in that air than you would have at 65 degrees at 75 degrees. With that in mind, let's look at some tips for managing your humidor during the warmer summer months. The first thing we should look at is location, because as you've probably observed, the sun comes into your windows of your home at a different angle than it does during the summer as it does during the winter. And your humidor might be in a nice shady location for winter, but might be hit by direct sunlight, heaven forbid, or at least be close to direct sunlight where it'll change the temperature significantly. The best thing to do is look for an area in your home where you can maintain the temperature as close to 70 degrees as possible. That might be a basement or a cellar, or choose the coolest room in the house. Another thing you can do is put it on the floor versus on a shelf, because hot air rises and the upper portion of a room is going to be warmer than the floor is going to be. Another thing you should do is cut back on your humidification, especially if you're using water beads or something like that. They'll kind of look at that sponge getting bigger, the temperature going higher, and say, hey, look, I can dump more humidity into this humidor. That's a bad thing. I would stick during the summer months if you're having an issue with Bovita packs. And the reason why is those are self-regulating to some degree. And what they do is they actually, as the temperature goes up, they'll put less moisture into the air. And it's a complicated process we won't talk about, but they do a pretty good job of that, but they aren't perfect. So what I would do too is if you do use Boveda packs, and let's say you run at 69 or 70% normally, I would go down to 65% in the summer just to be on the safe side. Because while they do self-adjust, they don't do it as quickly as you'd like. If you're really having a trouble with your room humidity or ambient humidity, and I've gotten comments on a previous video I did on this subject about that, where somebody said, I live in a tropical area, it's humid all the time, what can I do? I think your best choice there, honestly, is to look into Tupper doors. And the reason why is because a good Tupper door, the plastic containers we're talking about, are airtight. So when you seal it, you get that whoosh and you know that it's airtight. And that's not going to let that humidity in. So it's going to control that humidity at actually the lower amount, that whatever humidifier you have in there. If all else fails and you really have an issue, there are now electronic humidors available that control both temperature and humidity. And they're an investment of several $100s, and there's some maintenance required and whatnot on them. But if you're really in a pinch in a tropical area where there's really high humidity and you don't have the HVAC system to be able to reduce the humidity that's around your humidor, that would be the last resort, is to go with one of those electronic ones. All right, I hope you found these tips helpful. I will see you next time from Cigars, Cigars, Cigars.